Two, one. Hello, welcome to my podcast. I'm your host, Larry Liu, and today I'm joined by Mike Buhl again. So, Mike, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Welcome.
So where do we want to start today? So I was writing recently about the baby boomers and arguing that they were they're the peak of human civilization. And this is a thought that I've been having for a while now, but I was recently on a trip to Vienna in Austria, and that thought sort of germinated more and more. And so I was thinking about that because because of the climate emergency, right? So every year, everywhere you're seeing that there's more droughts, there's more heat waves, and it was like over 40 degrees Celsius, which is I think over 100 Fahrenheit, in London, in the UK. When I was in Vienna, I mean, I noticed that I was there for 3 weeks, and not on a single day it was raining. It was a totally dry, hot air, which is about 35 Celsius, I would say, maybe so about maybe 90 in the 90s. And I thought, well, actually, this wasn't all too common back in the past. I know when I grew up in Vienna, I left in 2008. There was one bad summer in 2003. That was when there was also like flooding, really bad flooding, and then massive heat wave. And then that summer, the mosquitoes were really, really bad. I still remember it because I was scratching my arms and legs all the time back then. But anyway, so that sort of made me very contemplative.
Mm.
I essentially argued that the Fridays for Future movement, represented by Greta Thunberg, is a very pessimistic movement, because all they are saying is they're not saying I want a good life. What they're saying is I don't want carnage, I don't want destruction. Just save the planet for my own future and for those of my descendants. So versus, I would say that the 1968 movements, youth movement, which was about addressing homophobia, inequality, racial discrimination, sex discrimination. This in the Western countries, and in the Eastern countries, it was about, and the Global South, it was about opposing brutal dictatorships. So in at least in that sense, I mean, it was a very hopeful kind of movement, because it was about creating a more inclusive, open, democratic society. Versus, I feel like that today's social movement seems to be about being very conservative. It's about preserving the lifestyle that we can, even facing this sort of contradiction between needing to generate economic growth on the one hand, but then also reducing, carbon footprint. Anyway, so.
No, that's a good entry point. I agree with your analysis. The 60s had this utopianism, this, I think Ironman called it seeds of the 60s. Think of music, right? Woodstock, youth culture was just exploding, sexual liberalization, right? Feminist movements were thriving. So this is a moment, I think, a utopian moment, especially in the West. Incidentally, at the same time, cars, think of like Volkswagen Beetles and all of this cultural capitalism, that was shaping our culture, in the West, at least, and there was progress. This is the boomer generation that was, at its peak at that point, right? And so you're right. I think this from the 1990s, maybe 2000s, you have a kind of dystopian, a pessimistic view, and that the world is going down. That there's global warming. We will all suffer, and the next generations, they will have no future. So yeah, there's just these two different views. 60s, we can have a good life, and we can expect something positive, and we'll have a thriving middle class, and everybody will have some things that they can own, cars particularly. And it was a time, right? Prosperous time, post World War II.
But we also
Now
have to say, I mean, even in the 1960s, I mean, there was a period of pushback, right? So I think that the anti-consumerist movements, anti-consumer collectives, there was a back to farm movement in Germany, the RAF, which were the
right.
communist activists that they did some bunch of nasty things, kidnapping and killings, etc. But their whole idea was kind of to show disappointment of the young people against this blind consumerism, and basically losing solidarity like in the old days. But you're right. I mean, but it was still an optimistic thing, because ultimately what happened to a lot of these you could say student revolutionaries was that even if you were stuck at the commune level for 3 or 4 years to experiment drugs, sex, rock and roll, etc., you could still, after that sojourn, go to a factory or go to an office, and then you could find a job, and it would still pay you a decent wage. You could still be able to raise a family with one income, and right. So I guess the idea really is that you really need to have this material access in order to experiment with yourself and to discover what is desirable for yourself. And right now, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it seems to be in the young generation. I mean, we're moving to this world of perceived scarcity, right? And the scarcity, I mean, it's punching on both sides. It is about economic scarcity, about where's the good jobs going to come from. And I say good jobs here is very important, because people say, well, we have a labor shortage right now, but there's a lot of jobs out there, but they don't pay very well, and
Service sector jobs, right?
yeah, not very stable and everything, right? So so that actually comes from the economic stagnation, which is what Wolfgang Streeck and Oliver Nachtwey, I mean, the German scholars talk about that. And then on the other hand, I mean, the scarcity comes from the impacts of climate change. I mean, in particular, the destruction of food crops, that is absolutely shocking. I mean, I think, I mean, if you have a sturdy stamina, you could say, you could take a look at agricultural statistics all over the world. I looked up India recently, and there's substantial amounts of crop failure. I mean, at least 15-20% or so. I mean, in Italy, I saw the wheat production fell by half, which is quite substantial. And I'm not, I don't know. I mean, we're also going to face heat waves in the U.S. I mean, in the Central Plains, which is the breadbasket of America and also the world. And yeah, and so to that extent, I mean, those things, I mean, they're also accelerating the food inflation, which is a big source of political instability everywhere in the world, right? And yeah, so we're basically being, punched in different directions, and so then it forces us to be very inventive, and it forces us to be, very, how should I say,
Proactive.
focused. Yeah, I mean, we have to be very proactive and focused on on solving the problem, at least at a collective level. Uh, but then I say also at the individual level, if you say, carpe diem, seize the day, you only live once, um, that might not be a very bad advice.
I recall reading in your essay, you're focusing also the essay that you posted on your blog on this generational dynamic, and that we can look at the boomer generation as living in the right time, structurally, the post-World War II economy was thriving. Ecologically, I mean, yeah, there weren't visible problems yet. And so that generation, when I look back, my own parents, which are boomer generation, and even with just a working class, kind of background, and they didn't have any education, they, were able to achieve a lot, make it to the middle class. And that's the same kind of technique that the sociologist Oliver Nachtwey does when he looks at his own kind of family uniquely. He looks at his grandparents and his parents and how they were able to build a nest egg in Germany. But the generations after the boomer generation, have seen a significant kind of decline and job insecurities and more problems as far as social protection, social integration. So definitely, and I don't want to sound pessimistic, but it seems like I'm very pessimistic, dystopian almost, way. The future generations, what they're going to be faced with, and of course, I'm considered Generation X, so I was born in '78. 80s generation. So I guess I'm starting to get old now too. But for Germany, for instance, it's true. I mean, the generation after the boomer generation, you saw a decline in wealth and income. You saw people no longer being able to build houses. Home ownership dropped, and renting. Everybody was renting, So you do see this drop, and you could see it then how these economic trends definitely impact generations differently, right? Different generations get impacted differently. So yeah, so when we're doing sociological analysis, what impact the economy has on future generations and what chances they have on a labor market, and how are they able to make it in this new economy, right? Competitive economy on top of all other problems, ecological, hyperglobalization. There's you might even talk about cryptocurrency, and it's risky, all this risk. So I'm kind of following then the work of I guess Ulrich Beck. I think we definitely have entered this hyper risk society, and these generations are the risk generation. I think these future generations, and I look at it and I see that, again, not to be Schadenfreude, right? Not to feel like that I'm glad I'm not them, but I really feel like this new generation has a lot of obstacles that maybe previous generations didn't have, So that's, yeah, but if you look at it from a generational perspective, you can romanticize the boomer generation, say they did have more prospects, opportunities, and then generations after that, living standards drop, right? Economic outlook is horrible. What could be the solution to a good society? That's the question. Does the state have to enter back into the picture? Right? We need active social policies, right? Basic income. What means could help us for the future generations? Well,
Yeah, well, that's why
but
I think the basic income debate is specifically coming on the heels of the financial economic crises, the ecological crises, etc. There's two more points that I wanted to bring up, also from that essay, and that's nationalism and war, because you see what is happening certainly, as there is less and less, economic security, there's the tendency demographically to its decline, because if you're not able to establish yourself, if you're not able to attain good jobs, then you're also less likely to start a family. You're less likely to, as you say, purchase houses and so forth. And so you have really a demographic decline, which is then followed by economic decline, because in a lot of Western countries, we have the social contract of paying pensions out of the current tax revenues of basically the workforce that is shrinking. And so as the perceived scarcity increases, the problem is that the neoliberal faction, right, which consists of both the center-left and the center-right parties, do not really have an answer to that. I mean, they just say, basically, keep grinding and good luck. And the nationalists seems to be the only faction in a lot of Western developed countries that are saying, we're going to return the community, but it's going to be a natural community, and so we're going to throw out the refugees and the immigrants, and the scarce resources we're going to allocate to our citizens in our country. And so that's what the America First rhetoric is all about. But then also, certainly in the European countries, right-wing populist movements that we see rising up in a lot of places. Marine Le Pen at about, I believe, 40% of the vote now, I think. And 5 years before that, she had about 33%.
AfD in Germany, right?
Well, AfD, I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, they're about 12, 13%, which, I mean, it seems to be a very constant percentage now. I mean,
Austria, FPÖ.
Well, the FPÖ is doing really well right now. I mean, it's like over 21%, 21, 22%. And consider, I mean, so in the last elections, they had 16% because they lost maybe about a third of the voters after the corruption scandal was published. But those ideas, they keep on coming back. I mean, just listen to the FPO interview recently with the leader of that party. And he was saying, it was of course attacking the inflation wave that is hitting a lot of households. The gas prices, electric prices are skyrocketing. And he's blaming it squarely on the gas war with Russia. And so he basically says that European countries have to pressure Ukraine to make concessions territorially, and then by creating the settlement in Eastern Europe, presumably the gas will continue to flow, the gas prices will come down, and the crisis will be over. But anyways, it's a very nationalistic kind of framing.
Well, Larry, I mean, if we take Polanyi's idea of counter movements, Karl Polanyi's work, The Great Transformation, and marketization causes counter movements to emerge. it sometimes can go either way. You could have nationalism, fascism as a response, or trade unionism, or state-centered responses, right? Social movements. But it's interesting, if we use that framework, we don't know. I mean, there could always be societal responses to economic trends, and it can go either way, far right or far left. That's the worry. That extremist movements utilize crises as a way to create, uh, uh, group formation, or how they acquire people to follow them, and populists usually, figure out a way to instrumentalize crises. That's another thing I'm worried about, usage of environmental catastrophes. So like here in Texas, let me give you an example. Like in Texas right now, there's extreme hot weather, and I wonder how people will react. Do they want extreme reaction? Just talk about perhaps controlling the power companies more, maybe even curtailing how much they can charge customers. So there's a possibility that political groups could tap into this worry about, it's a real worry. I mean, power prices are going through the roof, and if you can tap into that frustration of people, it can go either way. It can go to the far right, or perhaps the far left. So I don't know. There's always counter movement. So I think this problems in the economy can be used by political groups, and they may engage in counter movements, like environmental movements too, can sometimes emerge. Of course, we don't know how it's used, right, or for what purpose. Definitely, I would say that Germany, the Green Party success is with the youth, but also with the reality that Germany started to face, like many Western countries, ecological problems. Forests were dying, water pollution issues, water scarcity. Even some farmers started to show sympathy with green causes, right? So you can tap into those. These I would call these, in the Polanyian sense, they're counter movements. They're just counter movements to marketization, right? And even in the US, think of like Tea Party, right? These are counter movements. Sometimes they're fringe political parties that emerge because of problems, I guess, in the broader society, lacking social integration or some other economic problem. That's how I read Polanyi. I think he would be useful. Think about contemporary problems. Even basic income movement. Would you consider like basic income movement as a counter movement that tries to address this problem of economic security or income security, right? Consider it like a social movement, a little bit to the left.
Right. I mean, so
yeah,
these are all counter movements that you enumerated, and I think that both basic income, but then also the environmental and ecological movement, they are one of the most promising responses that we could develop with respect to the climate situation. We have to hope that that they gain more traction, and because we really have to tap on the accelerator here, with basically performing the energy transition to basically green sources of energy. That is to say, the ones that don't emit CO2. But it doesn't completely get rid of a risk society. I mean, even in the most optimistic projections, I know for Germany, there's been much more usage of green energy, like wind and solar panels becoming much more common. And they can in part replace the coal that is and gas that's being used. but I'm very much afraid that well, there's two problems with the sort of the push towards to renewables. First, I mean, it doesn't go fast enough, right? So, there's this idea about like decoupling between GDP growth and CO2 emissions, and in some rich countries we have achieved that kind of decoupling, where the CO2 goes down a little bit and the GDP continues to go up. But the problem is that actually, I mean, with the current trends in climate change, we have to move towards carbon elimination. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you have like reductions from, in CO2 emissions from 1990 peak of 15 to 20%, but we have to go down 100%. That's the first problem, and then and then the second issue that we are facing is how green is green energy, right? So I mean, I spoke with
you mean greenwashing. There's a lot of greenwashing going on, right?
Yeah, right. So I spoke with an expert in solar panels in Austria. He just imports the solar panels and then he helps with the installation in various homes and businesses. And so I asked him about the trash, the solar panel trash. That is to say, because after 30 years of usage of these solar panels, you have to discard them somehow because the components just not usable anymore. He was talking about like the possibility of doing recycling, basically taking some of the components out of that panel and then reinstalling them in new panels. But then he also admitted that it was incredibly uncommon still, but because the problem is that the solar panels as a technology have been around, well, I mean, for many decades, but you could start seeing the peak of the building phases. I mean, it starts around 1990s, and then after that, it's sort of accelerated.
So it's very toxic, right? I mean, the trash. Okay.
Yeah. So you have this solar panel trash, and now it seems like that we are now about to figure out, because we're de-installing the first generation of the solar panels that we built in the 1990s now. And so there's going to be a lot more like university and industry research to figure out what to do with the solar panel waste. But I mean, we're going to have to be creative about it. But I was just saying that, is there a possibility that we end up, increasing the pollution in the groundwater, for instance, because all that silicium and all of the mineral components that go into the solar panels are basically toxic chemicals that leach out into the natural environment.
Yeah, but it sounds like, we're damned if we do, damned if we don't, but something definitely has to be done. And what's your opinion on the €9 ticket? You hear about Germany's attempt to reduce this usage of cars and trucks, that they implemented a €9 ticket that you could use using train and trains, which created actually a lot of chaos in Germany. I don't know if you heard about it. It was
yeah, I did. Yeah,
June and July. I believe it was good for 2 months, and then they stopped it. But apparently, it did have unintended consequences, that there was a mass amount of people that started using public transit, right? But on the other hand, it illustrated the possibility of trying to utilize public transit as a way to discourage private vehicle usage. And usually, people, if they drive their cars to the beach, northern Germany, now they did it with train. and it made it really inexpensive even for working class people. It was €9. I mean, anybody has €9, right? But that's interesting. It was innovative. But so they subsidized it. They basically subsidized the state kind of, I think, gave some money to encourage this €9 ticket. But I don't know if that fits into our discussion.
Yeah, I was watching an interview with an elderly German lady, pensioner, and of course, she was complaining about the rising gas prices and the food prices and everything. But then she said that the €9 ticket was a great policy in the sense that it took one worry off of her, right? It's the transportation expenses that are sort of fixed in the budget and incredibly affordable. And I'm very strongly in favor of that policy. I think in Spain they said that they were going to impose an excess oil tax on oil companies, because as you might know, the oil companies are making money hand over fist because of the rise in the oil and gas prices, right? And they were going to use that revenue to subsidize the high-speed rail tickets. So it's a very similar scheme where essentially they're selling train tickets to the public below the cost price.
Subsidized. Okay.
Yeah, subsidized, exactly. And that would be subsidized from the excess oil revenues. And so I mean, if you think about the German word for tax, Steuer, right? Steuer is to steer, right? Is to push something in a certain direction, right? And right, so I think we should be steering away from the fossil fuel consumption, which basically means driving combustion engine cars and shifting to rail traffic. But then I don't know. I mean, with respect to flight traffic, however, I think there's going to be incompatibility, right? Because so I went to a conference in Amsterdam and I was looking up the train tickets from Vienna to Amsterdam, and well, I mean, I would have to switch the train at least once, and then some other routes it's switching twice, somewhere in Germany, and the total travel time is 17 hours.
Yeah, the train.
Yeah, it's like overnight train and then a day train. And it costs over €200, and then the flight was a little bit more than €100. And so, and of course, and it took about an hour and a half, maybe, flight time. So I mean, just to compare that, right? It just, I mean, with a carbon footprint, it's clearly better to go by train, but
right.
With the time and money, it just doesn't make any sense to take a train.
Which brings up the question of social class and who does create a lot of the carbon footprint. And I recall watching an interview with Sikhat Nickel, and I think I read it. Yeah, it was one of the newspapers. And who, as far as social class, really produces most of the carbon footprint are the more wealthier ones, surprisingly. And in the West, and working class people, travel less and can't afford the airplane tickets, so they tend to rely on other means. So I don't know, maybe there's a class component too, a footprint. Who creates think of like the private Learjet, one CEO flying one city to another, and the differences of social class and what role it plays as far as your carbon footprint's concerned.
Yes.
Periods. If there's any, I think I recall that he said statistically the upper classes have a larger footprint than the lower classes. Surprising in the West. Global South, I'm not sure how that plays out as far as pollution. Who pollutes more, the rich or the poor? I would think in the U.S. the middle class also. I mean, I always go to Costco. It's not so far away from here. By the way, I'm not advertising. Think of like Sam's Club and Costco. It's big SUV, consumers. There's the cheap gas or the subsidized gas somewhat. If you're a member, you get cheaper gas. But they have these large carts that you go into the stores and you're just filling up with all this extra stuff. So I always thought about middle class in the U.S. If perhaps the middle class also, creates a large carbon footprint, big SUVs, big vehicles, especially here in Texas, big trucks, and gas guzzlers. Okay. You don't see that many small cars. I notice in the Midwest and even in the South, you don't see as many small cars as you do in Europe. The little cars, the four-cylinder. So I wonder if that plays a role too. Your social class, like if you have an SUV, you take regular trips, long trips, consume more, right? That's my hypothesis. I think both the middle classes have a larger footprint, and then the upper classes have a larger footprint, particularly their lifestyle, what they consume, things like that.
Well, that is definitely true. I mean, and I would say you can say that definitely that this is a global phenomenon. I believe that even in the poor countries, if you have more money, you just can afford flight tickets, and you can afford to own a car, and then you can just get further. I mean, I remember I was reading a long newspaper report once about the impact that bicycles have on poor villages in somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa. I forgot which country it was, but the impression from that news report was that the impact was huge, right? That because basically in the old days, the villages would just go everywhere by foot. So they would have to walk by foot to get to the place where they get the water. What's it called? To the well. They would have to go to the well, yeah, with the buckets, right, in their hands. They put the bucket down a rope, and then the rope gets them down to the water, and then they carry the water in the buckets on top of the head, right? And then they walk back to the village. And this is usually a woman's job, interestingly, so it's very gendered. Mm-hmm. And also, if they had to go to work, like let's say, like they had a job, let's say, in a neighboring village, so they have to walk that too. If the kids went to school, I mean, if they lived in a very tiny village, maybe they have to make a trek to maybe a bigger village where the school was, things like that. And then well, how did they get access to the bicycles? I forgot exactly, but maybe there was some NGO from outside that sort of brought it in. But as soon as the village had access to the bicycles, it made a huge difference, right? That the travel time to work, school, and all these things, and even fetching water has substantially decreased. And
you don't mean motorcycles, right? You mean actual bicycles?
Yeah, bicycles.
Okay.
Bicycles, yes.
Okay.
Right.
All
So,
right.
I mean, with the motorcycles, I mean, you'd have to figure out the electric supply and also
okay.
the fuel and the gas, which itself costs a lot of money. I mean, like if you're like a really, really poor location where perhaps the infrastructure isn't so built out, maybe bicycle might be the only realistic option to be mobile beyond being on foot.
which
Um,
explains, I think, maybe creating cargo bikes are more common, maybe using sort of extending bikes as a way to transport goods, even throughout India, without a vehicle. Like, can you imagine transporting goods with a basic bicycle, but you have an extension in the back or something that you add on? It's very creative. There's all sorts of, by the way, websites out there that promote this cargo bicycle movement to encourage people to get creative in how they, use the bicycle.
so
In the
you're
West, it
referring to
seems
the
more
rickshaws,
recreational.
right?
I'm sorry.
You're referring to the rickshaws, right? That is the bicycle with basically a carriage attached to it in the
Yes,
back.
yes, or it's like an extension. It has like a little wagon. So it's
That's right.
very unique. South America, I know there's movements that there's people do it for livelihood. In the West, I get this impression it's recreation, it's sport. In Germany, you do start seeing cargo bicycles used by the mail service. Yeah. You do see them using cargo bicycles inside the cities. I think it's the same in Vienna. I would assume that you have some of these cargo bicycles that have like again, some kind of a compartment in the front where you can carry goods or some kind of. But in Scandinavia, there's this movement towards having children in front. You can ride your bicycle around, but it's more recreational. I don't know if they're really using it for economic movement, like goods and services yet. I could be wrong. Maybe newspapers, small things. When I was a student there, I recall that they would use cargo bicycles to deliver the local newspapers. Uh, they have youth or somebody, drive around the bicycles to pass out flyers or something. Maybe in recycling, people that engage in recycling, they would have these cargo bicycles, but which is possible because of the infrastructure in Europe, because everything is so closer together, right? Here in the US, I could see it happening in metropolitan areas, but I wouldn't see it in rural areas unless they have bike lanes, the infrastructure. Even Austin, Texas, which is bike friendly, by the way. It's a major city in Texas, but it's still mostly recreational bicycling. It's not yet using it for work, commuting, and stuff like that. Although here in the Dallas region, I occasionally see people using a bicycle to go to work. You can see people, with but it's a challenge because of the roads that are unfriendly. They're not really made for bicycles. So you have to really live in a city where they have bicycle lanes. Otherwise, cars dominate. My
Yes.
impression.
So
Yeah.
most roads in Vienna, they do have bicycle lanes, but not everywhere. I think that there's an initiative by the city government to make to basically become more carbon friendly by supporting the building of bike lanes. But in some areas where basically the roads are still incredibly narrow, and basically you reserve a lot of the space for parking vehicles, park cars, and so then what you have is, I mean, oftentimes, so you have like a one-way street, tiny street, and then you would draw in the bike lanes on the left side, with the arrow pointing against the one way. So if you're a bicycle, you can basically go both ways, right? Even on a one-way street. That's the idea, right? Right, but it's still, I don't know. I mean, it's not a fully protected kind of
Yeah.
bike lane in a real sense. And then when I went to Amsterdam, walking across the central city, you could see that bike lanes were literally everywhere. I think
Yeah.
almost every corner, right?
Would you agree with me that there's a youth culture that kind of embraces bicycling, especially university students and college students in Europe? Uh, I've noticed that students, youth make use of the bicycle far more than what I observed in the U.S. There's something about differences of political culture to where in the US there's still this individualism, everybody has to drive their vehicle to go to college, unless they live there, they have student housing. But in Europe, because of the way universities are often centered within cities and access, that it's more common to see the bicycle as a legitimate mode of transportation, right? And they have more accommodation for bicycles. And I used to go, I remember this when I was German university, massive amount of bicycles that students left behind. The ones that studied for maybe 2 semesters, and they literally had, just thousands of them everywhere. This is in Erlangen. And I was told that this is common across many European universities, that you have all these thousands of bicycles that students or former students just leave behind as a souvenir.
Is there a way for the municipality to handle those remaining bikes?
Well, there's often a forced removal process, as far as I recall. But what you often see is all these bicycles that have flats, and they could repair them, and they still have the locks on them. And there's a large market of just an oversupply of bicycles that just are left behind in universities. So those are students that studied before you, that were there maybe years before, and they never removed the bicycles. So you have these relics. I remember in Erlangen, it was massive amount of bicycles right at the university entry. They have a little bicycle area, or the major railway stations. You often see massive amounts of bicycles.
No, but I mean,
Now they're still
you
in
also have
use.
to consider that,
Yeah,
every year you not only have students that leave the city, but you also have new students that
right.
enter it. So, and I would think that that there should be, I mean, at the university level or at the municipal level, right? There should be some central exchange where it is possible uh, to basically transfer
Recycle.
at a very low cost. I mean, we're really
Yeah.
talking like 10 euros or something, to basically purchase used bikes that are still really good, right?
I mean, they have that too. Don't get me wrong, they have that too. But they used to have little bicycle repair shops and little bicycle stores, things like that. But just a surplus of bicycles, it's hard to imagine for most Americans. So many bicycles are used. Even in the Netherlands or Denmark, I mean, surprised the magnitude. Older people, middle-aged, younger, inclusive, very inclusive bicycle culture. So I don't know. Maybe that's one way to transition out of this, fossil fuel economy. Maybe transition to something like a bicycle-oriented society, more friendly. Uh, to open up new avenues. Of course, it would be difficult in hot areas. I'm thinking about the South, where it's extremely hot. And even I have this difficulty of every month I have a flat because it's just too hot for the tubes and the tires to take it. And you'd have to really have good equipment in order to sustain a bicycle. And that's the pain, because you're in hot weather, you have flats, and those are irritating, and they discourage you to use it as a form of transportation because it goes flat. But if there was some technology they could create, they have this tubeless bicycle tubes that you could don't worry about a flat, right? But can you imagine if you're in a hot weather, right? You're driving, and then your bicycle breaks down, and there's nothing in between, and you're stuck somewhere, and you're just commuting from a long distance, which can
Well, I
be
was
difficult.
totally unaware of that. So about
Yeah,
the link
a little off
between
topic, but a little
heat
off
and
topic.
bicycle problems. Uh,
Yeah, it'd be in hot weather, definitely. Yeah, go
yeah.
ahead.
Well, yeah, that's never happened to me before. I mean, at least not because of the weather. I've had flat tires many
Yeah.
times, just by having bad luck and driving over a nail or
Yes.
like a glass shard or something like that.
Uh,
That can definitely happen. But as for like getting a flat tire because of the heat, I think
yeah.
that surprises
Oh,
me a lot.
pavements literally get so hot in Texas that it could still be 100 degrees, even, I mean, the pavement, even at 9 o'clock p.m. tonight.
Wow.
So that means the heat is absorbed by the loop and the bicycle itself. And you can literally feel it. So that tears and wears the rubber, and there's very few, no matter how expensive you want to go, yeah, it can go through the loop and then you have a flat. So that's a problem. It's the pavement, it gets too hot. And I can imagine in places like California and Arizona, you have to get a perfect kind of bicycle loop to be sustainable,
Right. So
right?
so right now there's no material that you
They
could
do have
put on the
tubeless
bike. Okay.
loop tubes, tubeless, yeah, with very tough kind of covering around it so it prevents, but it's just an attempt to prevent a flat. It doesn't, mean there is not going to be a flat. But this gets more expensive. So this bicycle parts become more expensive. And of course, the bicycle shops, they want to make their money too, right? So replacement parts can run very expensive very quickly, right? And I mean, this is my observation. Like I'm a little larger guy, so I weigh more. There's also a little unfriendliness when it comes to availability of bicycles for people that are large and taller. So the market just focuses on this ideal bicycle rider that they have in their mind, but a lot of people, they may weigh more, and that puts more pressure on the bicycle, and you have to really, it gets more expensive. No, especially older people, they may need a three-wheel or with some additional support. So yeah,
Right. So
that's the bicycle market, by the way. That'd be a good industry to get into on the side.
it is, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So you mentioned like the hot asphalt, and I think
yeah,
that's a good transition because I was watching this documentary recently just about the heat waves that are striking in Europe, and
excellent.
obviously, if you go to the global south, I mean, like in India and South Asia, as the heat waves, or in Middle East, I mean, the heat waves are much worse, obviously. But right, so there's a big debate right now in many city governments to change the urban landscape to basically include more trees and parks, and then just putting some grass, some bushes around the walls of buildings,
Yeah.
and and I remember, I mean, I had this one neighbor here, well, it was back in Philadelphia, and one of the houses there actually had some leaves that were plastered on the side of the wall, and he said, "Oh well, this is bad because the mold grows there, and that could attack the building walls, and then it could maybe seep into the inside, and it could be very unhealthy to breathe in the mold." Um, right. I mean, maybe that particular house was a poor design, poor choice, but I would say that the overall idea of if you manage it correctly, the greening of the cities, I think is a very uh, good idea. Because I
Well,
know in a lot of German cities, I mean,
Stuttgart and Munich.
yeah, I mean, the issue, I mean, if you look at a lot of the central squares, where you have like the churches and it's like the open, an open central square, right? Where it's only asphalt and there's almost
Asphalt.
no shade. And then the city officials are then being asked, okay, well, why don't you put more green space into the squares? And they're like, well, if you do that, they're not principally opposed to it, but they're saying, well, you have to hire more people to as gardeners
Oh,
to maintain that
possible.
space. Yeah, well, I mean, like if you have like a central square that is full of asphalt, then occasionally, yes, I mean, you have to send people to patch up, like some holes occasionally, but it's very rare. I mean, I think
Yeah, 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 yeah.
while I think gardening, I think, is a very labor-intensive exercise throughout, right?
That's true. I never looked at it that way. Yeah.
Yeah,
Uh, I think in Texas, it's starting to bite a lot of municipalities is this concrete and highways, and it has an effect, I think, on temperatures. So when you go to grocery stores here, because of the intense heat, it absorbs it in the concrete and it contributes to even higher temperatures. And it creates problems and ecological imbalance, right? So because you don't have green spaces in the cities, people are more affected, especially the vulnerable population. So I'm thinking of homelessness and the health risks because of lacking green spaces. People are at greater risk, for heat stroke, heat exhaustion, including pets, by the way. In Texas, there's warnings to not allow your pet outside at a certain time because the concrete is still so hot, it literally burns the paws of pets. It's extremely hot. And that's all because of concrete. This focus on concrete. It was a cheap solution, I guess, at that time to build infrastructure, build the highways everywhere, but not building green spaces, right?
right. So if you have like a grass or lawn, I'm sure that you can walk around there, right? That's not
Oh,
an
yeah,
issue.
yeah. But yeah, that's an issue also with water consumption, and the difficulty of maintaining a balance of not using too much water resources to have everything green. So that right now, that's an issue too, which is interesting connection to the middle class homeowners in suburban neighborhoods that because they have large houses, and large yards, they're consuming way more water, right? Often late at night. And so they have to put in
Then people who
place,
live in apartments, I guess. Yeah.
yeah, because people live in apartments, they don't have, that much grass to worry about. So there is definitely this inequality of, who wastes a lot of water, and pools are a luxury thing, maintaining pools because it is so hot. I mean, we have public pools, stuff like that in Texas. I'm sure where you live, they also have public pools. But the expense and water waste for individual private pool maintenance, think about it. I mean, if every household has their private pool outside, and just the pure water consumption, it was ridiculous. So I definitely think that that is something to worry about in the future, right? The way the infrastructure is built and the way people live in houses, right? I actually have this prediction, Larry. This is my prediction. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. In 30 to 40 years, they will probably, if the heat keeps going like it goes, they will have to kind of build domes, and it will be kind of cooled, and we'll probably live in community settings more again. I don't think it'd be possible on a massive scale ecologically to have this individualistic kind of, everybody has their own single house, own single yard. 30, 40 years, I think it'd be very much impossible unless you're really affluent. I think they would have to figure out a way to conserve energy and to conserve water consumption by big domes, like in Mars. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. I don't know.
Well, the
I think we'll have
domes would have to encompass the entire city, right?
it was something
They would
like
have
that.
to
It would
be
have to be
huge.
a massive cooling system of some sort. What we have malls, malls in the US kind of do that. And malls, interestingly, have declined, the last 20, 30 years because of, things like Amazon. But I can imagine that they would probably in the future have to go back to this model to, manage so many people, especially in hot areas, to cool off and to live there. And some massive hotels already do it. There's some massive hotels that have large residential living spaces, and it's a kind of cool environment. I think it might be a solution to an ecological problem, because then at least you're combining resources, you're using it. You have a way to kind of regulate ecological problems. But if you have it individually, everybody has their own individual house and individual electricity consumption, old AC system, think of all the waste. I was thinking about the waste because of individual houses. Everybody has individual AC units, individually regulates the air in their houses. And that's what contributes to a lot of electrical waste. Right?
Right. I mean, so the whole idea of individualism, I think, is based on abundance, right? The idea that, there's enough resources around for everybody. And I think that, I mean, in terms of the world civilization, I would very much think that the Americans are at the most forefront of this kind of individualistic kind of thinking, rather than thinking about, holistic approaches to, and communal approaches to solve things like climate change. Yeah, right, because it's about the living space for sure, as you mentioned. Being able to, see, there's this big debate about, like, does climate change need more urbanization, or does it need ruralization, right? But like lowering the population density and the amount of basically concentrated space in which you have to deliver the services to. And because the idea is that, it also takes an incredible amount of energy to sustain cities. I mean, the economic spheres, and also living spaces and so forth. And I have a feeling more that I think urbanization is probably the better way to go, because I mean, if you have like this suburbia, I mean, as you say, okay, I'm gonna install the AC units in every house individually, and then if if these inhabitants, if they want to go to work, then they presumably have to commute. So everyone has a car, right? And so of course the car itself is a very polluting space as well.
Yeah.
So it's like and then versus, like, I think if you make urban design that is based where you basically everything is more concentrated, right? So you could actually maybe walk to work, or you could bicycle to work, right? Or take public transportation. Or if you want to go to doctors, if you want to go to whatever, the gym. I mean, also all very much close by, right? And you can do that in urban designs.
Yeah.
So I mean, my impression actually would be that that urbanization is better for the climate.
Yeah, with affordable housing, if it becomes unaffordable, then you have this problem again of people trying to move outside to commute back and forth. But that's often been the problem, I guess, with urbanization, is also gentrification, and cost of living is expensive. And to see the problem with Austin, Texas. Austin, Texas is a great example of you could try to have more public housing alternatives. You could have more affordable housing, but they have decided the last 20, 30 years to go with a market approach. And they think that market will solve it, But now the problem is you have many people can't afford it. So then they move out in some trailer park or some rental area 15, 20, 30 miles outside of Austin. So then you have displacement of people that are dependent upon jobs, and so they're commuting, they have to, right? But the only way they can commute is through a automobile. And so then the whole city becomes filled with cars everywhere, and there's no parking spaces available. And then so it creates a problem. Lack of affordable housing, lack of public housing options, and a pure market-oriented housing approach. And I'm just speaking of my observation, and when I read papers in the Texas area, I hear similar problems exist through metropolitan areas in the U.S. as people are still kind of unable to afford, living in the city, and then they try to commute or they double up, with others. There's explosion of roommates.com, right? There's all sorts of profiting off of the housing. Even extended stay hotels, and there's a whole market, right? But just, the lack of affordable housing. By the way, Andrew Ross, I want to mention him. He wrote a book he published this year on the failure of American housing. He focuses on Florida, I believe one of the major cities. I'm really going to recommend it, even for, I just got started reading it. And he also observes this problem in Florida, this problem of just lack of affordable housing and the difficulty in finding a place that is affordable for working class people and even middle class people. So what happens in Florida starts to happen everywhere else, my observation. So I'm curious, even trailer parks, maybe not always that bad. We often have a stigma about trailer parks. The culture kind of stigmatizes trailer parks as slums and things, but sometimes they are affordable options, surprisingly. Trailer parks in Texas, they can sometimes be affordable, surprisingly. Now, the quality of the housing is not as good. I don't know, Larry, have you ever seen trailer parks?
So is there like a cost to its renting? So I mean, I must assume like you own that the trailer, right? So you
usually rent trailer, and it's on a space that's occupied. It's becoming actually a kind of, I would call it a shadow housing economy that is parallel to the housing economy we think about, people living in rental apartments and houses, brick houses, townhomes, things of that nature. I think trailer park have already become alternative ways that people live.
So you have to rent the trailer and the parking space.
Usually there's some, my brother did a deal like that. It's usually renting both. You're renting, or there's some deals that the trailer park owner makes, or the person that manages it, and there's always one empty. There's always, but it's becoming a topic. I mean, because of this unaffordability living in the city. There's a lot of people that do this commuting. I can speak.
So what's the rental cost that you can get for the trailer
Let's say
park?
Below $1,000 trailer park. If you have a trailer, 2-bedroom, 1 bath or something, this trailer is just a small little unit, adequate, AC.
Well, even that is fairly expensive. I mean,
it can go lower. I mean, there's some trailer parks where it can go down to $600 a month or $700.
Right. I mean, if you're in the Northeast, I mean, I would think that housing like 800-900 is sort of for a room,
apartment
in an apartment. Yeah, that's right.
Well, let me give you an example. In Richardson, Texas, I think you can find some apartments that are at the $800 range, but then it easily goes up to like $1,200, $1,300. So I think a lot of people, what they do as a solution, if they're working class, is they double up, and then there's a kind of splitting of rent. But You got to imagine if you're.
But they would rent 2 bedrooms, right? They wouldn't rent
Sorry?
1 bedrooms.
It depends. Yeah, the more bedrooms you have, the more costly it's going to be. But Texas, I mean, you have to remember that the income of most Texans is a lot less in the South compared to the Northeast. So it hurts a lot when even a small amount of rent increases. Right? If we had a lot of movement transfer people from California that moved into Texas, so there was a tight housing market, which caused the increase of housing rent go up, and so it caused a lot of problems for people. It went above their pay in some examples. So if you have a good paying job, you could overcome it, and you could it's just taking a larger chunk of your income. But if it's taking 60% of your income, 70% of your income, imagine, right? If you're working class, that's a big chunk. So then people look for alternative housing. And that's why you have this Austin dilemma in Austin, Texas, where it's just ridiculous for working class people. So then they have to move out. So then you have these kind of people living further outside the city. That's something to think about, and causing ecological problems, right? Traffic congestions, and the infrastructure is not adjusted. So the infrastructure is not able to keep up with this rapid, development. So that's something to think about. Right, future generation. Yeah,
right. I mean, so this issue about
yeah.
rising housing costs, I think, it seems to be a global phenomenon, because when I visited my friends from childhood days in Vienna, and even they were complaining about the rents were partly a problem, but then now I think it's the energy costs mainly, because the war is still ongoing. You have the gas rationing from Putin, and there's fears about cold winters, cold apartments in the winter.
Yeah. It's cold in Vienna, right? The winter.
Yeah, I mean, it might seem very far away right now, because I was still chafing under like 95-degree heat back then. But right now, but I would think that that they would be very much concerned about the cost of living.
Yeah.
And what do you do, because the wages they're not increasing at the same rate, right? But still, I would still think that the housing policies in Vienna is much better. I mean, they have 200,000 public apartments that house 500,000 people in a population of about 2 million, so about a quarter of the population are in public housing, and that gives a lot of leverage to this municipal government to use basically market means to prevent what you might call rent exploitation, like Matthew Desmond, my professor here, talks about this rent exploitation concept, right? Which is basically the idea that the landlord can jack up the rents because of the housing shortages that exist.
That's an interesting concept. Well, I'm familiar with Matthew Desmond's work on eviction, the politics of eviction, but rent exploitation, that sounds like an interesting concept to read on.
Yeah, I think
basically there's no alternative choice. Am I reading it correctly? That because there is no alternative choice, then you have this problem of excessive rent costs being kind of put onto renters because they don't have other options to find alternative housing options.
Yeah, I mean
Rates,
that's the whole point of like housing shortage, right? That
yeah,
if the supply
exactly.
is capped. But I mean, I find it very interesting because I mean, in Vienna, I mean, so when I was growing up in the 90s and 2000s, the subways would stop at a certain stop. I think in Kagran is the was the last stop of U1, which is the main one of the main subway lines. And now it goes out to Leopoldau, which is basically, I guess, 5, 6 stops that were added to the northeast of the city. If you look at the geographic map in Vienna, I think that it's kind of covered by the mountain areas in the northwest, northern part, western, and then southwest. So and then on the far eastern side, you have what's called Marchfeld, which is basically the breadbasket of Austria. So we have all the wheat fields are located there. So essentially, I mean, I think there's only one direction in which the city goes. It's kind of like northeast, because there you have, yeah, it's kind of like open space. Some of it is agriculture, but a lot of open space. And they're starting to build it out because the population is just growing so fast. I mean, even with like very aggressive housing plans that the city set up, both for private and municipal housing, the rents are still increasing, which means that they're not building fast enough, right? So yeah, there's a big.
Is there a homelessness problem in Austria? I mean, in the cities, I guess it's common everywhere in Europe, but is it a serious issue or of homelessness, or do they have like homeless shelters and places for the homeless to go that the municipalities offer a housing first program of some sort, or do they? Is this still
Yeah,
a
I'm
problem?
not familiar whether there's housing first, but I know that there's definitely
Homeless.
municipal resources that there's definitely homeless shelters. But when I was walking in the streets of Mariahilferstrasse, one of the main shopping streets in Vienna, at nighttime, you can see people sleeping outside next to the next to the closed shops, because the shops are obviously closed at night. And but I mean, but those nights are also relatively warm, right? It reminded you a little bit of California, right? Which is the nation's worst housing problem, obviously, in the U.S. But I mean, but if it's nice and warm outside in the evening, it might be okay to sleep outside, right? The fear is that like if it cools down, that I mean you obviously cannot sleep outside. You can't
No, you
survive it.
freeze to death. Like,
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. What about panhandling? Is that a problem? Panhandling?
Yes, you're seeing that too now.
Yeah.
I think, but it's not going to be as bad as you I mean New York City, Philadelphia. I mean, whatever big towns and stuff.
Dallas. Yeah.
Yeah, but you're starting to see that.
Is it criminalized or is it tolerated? Or is it, do they sanction it? Or is it, I'm curious, in Vienna or cities like that? I don't know. Europeans often had a soft approach to this, but I don't know. I think the police start to get involved, particularly when children are involved in panhandling. But I know, I don't know how bad of a problem it is in Europe or in European cities. But the reason why I bring this up, this has been a topic of mine in my intro classes that I teach, panhandling here in Dallas, and the ways in which the city municipality, has looked at it and examined it from a structural position and also what areas are hot spots. It's actually a very interesting topic sometimes to dive into. But I'm curious how European cities have dealt with it, or how they, or what mechanisms they use, carrot stick approach, or they ignore it, or Do they criminalize it? I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not. I didn't study this particular
Okay,
issue, so I'm not.
that's good. Just
But
asking.
it seems like I would give you a gut reaction, probably
Okay,
right,
just checking.
that it's more laissez-faire approach, and
Okay. Okay.
yeah, and sort of leaving it be.
What,
Yeah, it it. I mean, the issue is also. I mean, so I remember a few years back, I went to Poland, to Warsaw,
uh,
um, and um, and I remember, I mean, that in the center city, I mean, they had these. I guess the Roman Sinti, I guess the Gypsies, and yeah, I mean, it's very open, panhandling, and
yeah.
uh,
What about fare dodging? I'm curious about that. Uh, the reason why I bring this up, when I took my vacation in the summer, right, first part of the summer, in Germany, I was in Nuremberg, Germany, and fare dodging is really not tolerated when you're on a German train. And they literally do check every ticket. And so fare dodging means that you don't have the correct fare, or you don't have a fare and you're trying to avoid paying for the train ticket, right? So you get caught, and it may even be that you accidentally purchased the wrong fare, which was my case, my situation. I actually had a situation where I purchased the wrong kind of fare. I was on a train that was high speed, and I was supposed to be using a train that was original train. So a little mistake, but 60 euro penalty, right? So I'm curious about also fare dodging, um, and how it's dealt with. And I looked at it. I remember when I drove, not just in Europe, by the way, in the U.S., fare dodging. It's kind of, yeah, they have fare enforcement officers that get paid to find people that don't have a fare, right? So it is criminalized, but to control it has always been interesting. Difficulty in controlling it is another story. And increasingly, there's so many people that fare dodge. I wonder if they're able to sanction everybody. But in
well, my
Europe, I
my
know they use. Yeah, go ahead. Your view on it,
well,
or
my
even
impression
where you
was.
live now. Yeah, yeah. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
my impression was that the Americans are much stricter with the fare dodging, large parts because all the trains, they have the conductors that are going up and down the aisle. For In the European systems, I mean, definitely in the Viennese system, it's kind of like a trust and punish system where they trust that you purchase the ticket. And then occasionally they send people into the wagons to basically check the tickets. And usually, I mean, they usually catch people who didn't purchase the fare. Um, and I mean, while I was there in Vienna, I mean, I met the conductor twice, but that was only uh, like a selected route. It was basically the from the airport to the center city, um, and um, and that was the only two times that I saw the conductor. But when I was taking, because if you were inside of Vienna, right, you're probably going to be taking the tram, which is, I guess, the trolley, the bus, and the subway, right? And each of these, I didn't see the conductor once. I had purchased a ticket, and
Just in case, right?
yeah,
Never
yeah,
know.
yeah, because I have recalled from, I guess, the from the experience in the States, that you had to purchase a ticket before getting on the train.
No.
um and but yeah, I mean, but also the fare structure, I mean, they make it such that they incentivize you to purchase more days if possible, right? uh, so that the unit cost would go down. So if you purchase like a single ride ticket, it's, I think, €2.40 now, which is quite expensive. And then for the day ticket, I think it's like €8. But then if you purchase the weekly ticket, that's €17. So basically, you would only have to catch the public transit, 2, maybe 3 days out of the week, in order to reach cost parity with a day ticket, right? And then for the annual ticket, it's 365. So it's basically €1 a day. Well, if it's €17 a week, I mean that's what, €2.5, maybe €2.5 per day. So I guess the incentive is to basically purchase the longer intervals. But I mean, but for tourists, it doesn't make any sense because
No, not at all.
Yeah, I mean, if you
Yeah, it
stay
seems more locals will probably engage in fare dodging more, and tourists they make an accident or they purchase the wrong ticket. Kind of what I observed. But yeah, it's an interesting topic though. How society deals with it, and what are the reactions in different parts of the world when it comes to fare dodging. That's a social problem. Like. And that's always been an interesting topic for me.
Right, but so
Yeah.
the Europeans are definitely more trusting. I mean, you see this with other institutions as well. So, for instance, I mean, the airport controls, where, I mean, like the customs. I think the Americans are much stricter, right? They'll ask more questions. They're much more nosy. They kind of want to know, where did you go? Why did you go? And all these other things. And then the experience in Europe. I mean, especially if you have like a Schengen passport, right? It's like they'll just wink you in without questions, right?
Right.
And now, I mean, I was reading a Twitter account recently by a woman from, I think it was Tunisia, it was some African country, traveling to the States via Germany. So it would probably land at an airport in like Frankfurt or Munich or something. And then because Lufthansa is in strike, right? So you had the workers not going there. So she had to basically be rebooked onto a different plane the next day. And the people with the American or with a European passport, you could just, they could just leave the airport, and they could, book a hotel to stay for the night. But a Tunisian woman, she would basically be stuck at the airport at night.
Oh, that's
and because I mean, essentially, I mean, the police were like, "Well, we're not gonna." I mean, what we're not going to let you in, essentially, right? Into the country.
There's a hierarchy of passports, kind of, right? The passports, the way they're treated, the passports themselves. There's a website I recommend that looks at this hierarchy of passports, and where you can get in with your passport. If you have one from the West or Canada or Germany or Switzerland, and then the lower score passports enable you to often even go to a country, and you have to have a visa. It's difficult. It's a really interesting website. It's Global Passport. I think it shows the scores.
Yeah.
So if you said Tunisia, I would suspect it would be lower score passport. And so maybe, I don't know, maybe the officials react, based on the view of the passport, I guess.
That's exactly right. Yeah. It's
do they
definitely
rank the passports too? I mean, do they still do that at Border Patrol? Most countries, they rank the passports, like if it's EU, Schengen, and then there's America, Canada, and then there's like stages. I don't think it's formal, but I think sometimes there is this usage of ranking that's used by different governments.
Yeah, I mean, so
like Swiss passport is, or Liechtenstein. I don't know how they're treated. So
There's
yeah, so
definitely a
yeah,
hierarchy. I mean, so
yeah, yeah, yeah.
when I came back to Vienna, I mean, the person in front of me, she was American, and I just looked at that, brief exchange, and the customs officer just opened up the passport, scanned
Yeah.
it in, and then put the stamp, and then just gave it back. I mean, it's really about this idea that, yeah, I mean, if you're from another rich country, I mean, we'll trust that you stay here, and will, whatever, contribute to the economy, right? Because you purchase things and pay sales taxes. You're part of the tourist economy. We trust you to go back. I mean, at the end of your trip. Um, so yeah, but then with a poorer country, it's different, right? Because if a poor country person goes to the rich country, then there is a reasonable suspicion that the poor person is not going to return back to the home country.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, like, look, I mean, if you're fleeing from war, destruction, famine, whatever, I mean, or just a poor economic situation at home, I understand. I mean, I understand their motivation about the reasons for migration, the reasons for
Yeah.
moving.
Survival,
Yeah.
survival. The story about here in Texas, there was a couple of months ago, I believe 50 or more people that were discovered in the back of a truck trailer, and they died because of heat. And these were undocumented migrants that were trying to cross from Mexico, but the identity of the migrants were reached back to El Salvador and I believe Guatemala, so even Central America. And this act of desperation, to seek a route into the United States with unintended consequences, of death. I mean, dying in a trailer is horrible if you think about it. I mean, and this luxury we have in the West of, that we have passports and we have privilege and we're able to be tourists, but if you are a citizen of the global North, but if you're a citizen of the global South, there's double standard, a different kind of standard applied. Fortunately, this means often the price of death, or harm to oneself, I think it was 50, 60 people. It's real tragedy. 50, 60 people,
Wow.
and this has occurred now during the summer months as well. In South Texas, McAllen, Texas, this area where there's lots of routes, migrants try to find a way across, including the desert areas of Arizona and New Mexico. Can you imagine how deadly it is, the heat, and difficulty in calculating the risks. But people take the risk, and they, all age groups, by the way. I mean, old people, younger migrants, children. Uh, you know, so that really reveals this globally stratified world we live in. And the passports give people ranks and privileges, and others don't have.
It's definitely tragedy that steers to action. So
Yeah.
if you remember in the 2015 European refugee crisis, that um, was really spurred by the image of this, dead Syrian boy that was
Yeah. Powerful, yeah.
driven on shore, I believe in Greece or something like that. And after that image basically was publicized in the world, the German government, Merkel at that time, was opening the borders to the refugees, and then Austria became part of that transit country, but also itself took on a lot of refugees. I think there's 90,000 people at the height of it. Um, and um, and then when the waves were coming, There was very similar. There was one tractor trailer with maybe dozens of people from, I guess, from Syria mostly, who essentially suffocated. And when they opened up the trailer, I mean, it was all corpses. It was a very bad stench, I guess. And yeah, I mean, those things happen. I mean, because I mean, if you make the decision to flee, I mean, you have to. I mean, there's no choice. I mean, you have to trust the smugglers that you paid some money to, and then for those hours and days, your life is essentially in their hands. And
Yeah, it's a real risk. Real risk. I wanted to just we're on this topic, I'm going to recommend Volker Heinz, who is a proponent of open borders and
Offene Grenzen für alle.
Yeah, the title of the book, Offene Grenzen für alle, Open Borders for All, and then it says Eine notwendige Utopia, a necessary utopia. And he is a critical sociologist who fits into this critical camp, but he makes the case that, you know, if we really are an open society, an inclusive society, and we're celebrating, you know, open borders and market forces, then that should include humans too, being able to move and be mobile, and not just select few elites that can get and purchase passports and have 4 or 5 different nationalities. That's the case with Russian oligarchs or American oligarchs. So he kind of gets into this discussion about the contradictions in Western society, but when it comes to borders, it's kind of revealed, this contradiction. Why isn't that, in the 21st century, there's some way that we can move towards a more inclusiveness and open border model. We can still have security, but we definitely, like in the European sense, the Schengen model is something that could be duplicated. North America and, Central America, South America could possibly occur, maybe not in my lifetime. I don't know, maybe in yours, Larry, or the generation after, right? It's something. It's a utopia because for him, it's some ideal that is something good, and there could be a good for society. We have all this pessimism and all this dystopian stuff, ecological crisis, but maybe this is one of those utopias that could be fruitful. Or Erik and Wright, what did he call it? Radical utopias. Those are radical
realistic
utopias, but they could, change paradigm, maybe even help academic institutions, which are so entrenched into this national container model. I look at a lot of times academic institutions that are kind of also restricted with the kind of research they do, and they're forced to kind of do within a national framework. And if you had open borders, scholars could, move around without having to worry about not having the right passport to get in. They're facing academic persecution in their home country. They could attend a university somewhere else. So often when I went to ASA meetings, it was quite ironic, because I went to some meetings where we were talking about like global stratification or global human rights, and even some of the presenters are saying the lack of people from the global south. It's lack of people that couldn't participate, or they didn't have the right visa in time. So there was one ASA meeting, was in Montreal a couple of years ago, and Canada has difficulty, for some scholars to get in, and
some scholars at American institutions, they had like an F1 visa, but they couldn't get to Canada, basically, right?
Yeah, there was still problems. So it's interesting. You have global north. It's a fortress, and universities are part of that fortress too. I mean, you want to kind of have a monopoly of
knowledge production and, the prestige of institutions is sort of safeguarded, I guess, if they think that if they only have national scholars for the national culture and national area, then you will just have particular narratives, or particular focus on research. But that's why I think, I'm going a little further here, but think about like credentialization, like how difficult it would be for a scholar that acquired their degree from a university in India or university in Latin America, and then try to, become a researcher or find employment in a global North institution. You have to get it evaluated, then there's this bureaucratic mess you have to go through, right? And that's why a lot of people from the global South have difficulties sometimes if they seek employment. Let's say for academic jobs, is they're eliminated already from the credential standpoint and the stigma, But I think that the degrees are fake or something. I think the degrees are worthless. They're not at the same level. That's the view sometimes.
I mean, it's a justified view. I mean, there's definitely a global hierarchy there, but I think the example with the scholars really shows that it is our crowd that is the most interested in the sustaining the liberal internationalist order, and I think that open borders and international migration, and welcoming international migration is definitely a big piece of cosmopolitan identity. But I was wondering whether Volker Heinz was, sort of addressing the I could say the anxiety that other classes have. That is to say, basically the working class of the developed countries, of the rich countries, who basically are the most afraid of having the value of their citizenship being diluted by unrestrained migration. Because I mean, even if you think about it, I mean, if you're a very high skilled individual from the global north, you are not very concerned about the competitive pressures from the high skilled people from the global south. In fact, I mean, if you look at a lot of these like technology companies or financial institutions or consulting firms and so forth, law firms, they face such a massive talent shortage that even with the domestic high skilled pool being tapped, and also tapping the H-1B visa process, for which there's a cap for it, right? An annual cap. They still are searching for new talent. I mean, so basically the demand side of labor at the high skill level is so high that even with more internationalization, it's never going to tilt to its labor shortage. But then the flip side is that if you look at the lower skilled migration, I think that there is some competitive effect here, not in the sense of driving up unemployment, which I don't think there's any study that has shown that bringing more migrants increases unemployment, but rather that the wages basically stay low and stagnant because of the easy availability of low-skilled labor from abroad. And that is one of the reasons that both the high-skilled population of the global north, as well as you could say the CEOs, the ownership class, the capitalists of the global north, are the major factions that favor open borders and international migration. And I'm a little bit worried that, you know, if Volker Heinz goes too much on the libertarian human rights discourse, that he neglects the other side of it, of the, you know, domestic work class.
He's definitely more left-leaning, social democratic oriented, but he European tradition, you know, of solidarity, of social solidarity to enable others to be mobile. And mobility should be something that we grant to individuals, not necessarily just to goods and services and objects that can move borders, you know, like in containers, but humans themselves. So I have to be honest, I have to read through the last part of it still. But he comes from that Frankfurt School tradition, so it's more of a critical thinker. Now, I do want to mention another one, Stefan Mau. He's written one, Sortiermaschine. He argues that modern borders represents, I don't know what sortier means, what translating.
Well, to sort, yeah.
Yeah, sorting out mechanism. That what borders really are is a filtering mechanism, you know, for the economy and for the political state to, you know, filter out who they want or who they don't want, right? And if they think, like you're saying, high skilled versus low skilled, this view what does the economy want and what is needed in the economy and that given the economy. I believe Canada has a similar model like this. In order to acquire a green card in Canada, it's a lot easier if you can prove to the authorities that your skill matches what they need. So it's not like a humanitarian focus, so just open it all up, but rather what you could bring to their economy. You know, that's and if you can,
right, so you get extra points if you know English and French, right?
Yeah, especially in the provinces. I think the provinces have their own ways of allowing people to come to their provinces. So it's a federal level, but also at the provinces. So like, you know, Quebec and Montreal, they can allow migrants in based on their conditions, and if there's a need for IT specialists or nurses or something, they could do it. A year ago, I was personally looking into this, like what's the process for academics? You know, if there's any way for social scientists to make a move towards Canada, you know, but it's a supply demand model, but it's based on what they think is needed in their economy, and then they adjust it, you know, favorable that you get a green card or you don't, or you have to show you already have an employer set up. The employer is going to offer you a job, things of that nature, right? The same is actually being done now in Germany. Germany has a program where they're desperately needing IT and others with skills, construction. So they're recruiting in places like Vietnam, so outside of the EU, right? And they're giving them preferences so then you can get your permanent residency easier in Germany if you have that skill set. Like, right. So,
right.
yeah.
It's very interesting. I think Canada is probably one of the countries that is the most cosmopolitan ideologically, that is to say, open to migration. But a big secret, obviously, behind that cosmopolitan position is precisely the quota system that you mentioned, and that creates a very high degree of legitimacy. I mean, of course, you can be very open-minded about immigration if only the jobs are being taken for which there really is no available domestic, supply. So it's a bipartisan national consensus that immigration is positive.
Interestingly, between the left and the right, I think in Canada it's like consensus.
Yes.
Whereas in the US, it's kind of the right is always against any kind of, like when it comes to immigration itself. but the left is often more inclusive, always more inclusive in the US. But in Canada, there's like a consensus of the quota system. But I think in the US, you can see the frigidness because of the two-party system, they have to kind of be antagonistic. So they always have to
it's the objective situation with the geography. So, I mean, the border of the global south is basically the Mexico-US border, right?
Texas, yeah.
So, I mean, the fact that, I mean, if you're from Honduras and you want to flee the gang violence, if you want to flee the drug cartels, then you go to America. I mean, and I mean, I've debated with right-wing friends about this immigration topic. I mean, I'm not taking the position yet that we should be going towards abolishing the borders totally. Because I mean, because you're going to suffer from legitimacy issues that if the global south citizens all move to the global north, then the living standard in the global north would decrease, at least for the people that are already lower income in the global north, right? The high skilled, the rich, I mean, I think they'll always be fine, but they can always move to their enclaves that are safe. But yeah, so it's going to be legitimacy issues if you open up the borders totally. But then the other extreme of like building up the wall and not letting in any migrants from poorer countries is also not a sustainable position. Because because one of the problems that we are having is that the United States itself is how should I say, very much into like regime change and contributing to political turmoil in some Latin American countries and elsewhere in the Middle East. You could say, well, okay, the Americans, maybe we don't cause all of the political turmoil, but certainly it's one of the factors there. Backing up, corrupt dictatorships ultimately. And then the other thing has to do with the climate situation. I was reading about, I think, in the Central American, the Triangle countries, where agriculture is essentially wiped out by the heat waves, the climate change, right. So I mean, if you're like a really poor farmer, right, you're already not making enough money. Then you have the drug cartels that are coming to your neighborhood, and they say, well, you can work for me, and then I can offer you protection, or if you don't work for me, then you have to pay me, and if you can't pay me, maybe I have to shoot you. So so I mean in that sort of state, I would think that that migration is a rational option. I mean, even if at the cost of potentially death, right? Because crossing the Rio Grande is not easy task. If there's already a fence, there's a wall maybe in some regions already. So, I mean, if my choice is between dire poverty and almost certain death, I mean, at home versus possible death crossing into America, maybe the second route would be better for me.
That's a basic cost benefit analysis that people calculate. They're like, what's my chances and what is my risk? And the extent to which people take risks reveals the power, I think, of agency. That we often think of structures that dominate and constrain. That's how sociologists think, structure, strain, economics. But the power of agency of individuals, to try to navigate and escape a state, or go in this route and go in that direction, it's something to be respected, if you think about it. Of course, one has to have empathy. But think about it, people take a calculated risk, maybe knowing that it may end up that they die, not getting close, or they eventually die of dehydration somewhere in the Arizona desert. It's horrible, but it's a calculation. I think it's an individual calculation that's made sometimes with incomplete information. I can see that happening. Sometimes people may have incomplete information and they don't know, okay, this is more time consuming. You're talking about walking, 500 miles in a desert area. And but I think as sociologists, maybe a lot of times we think too much structures. I agree that there's this economic strain and there's strain in the country where people have no other options, and then they take matters in their own hands and illustrate agency, an agency. The same. What's interesting? If you look at the flip side, a glorification, like when East Germans fled into West Germany in the 80s, when East Germany was still a communist state. There was this films and movies that came out of illustrating all of these techniques of how they, went through the tunnels, and some of them had balloons, some of them did all this adventurous, brave thing, that is was treated in the movie industry at that time as a way to discredit, like communist systems, and to say that individuals were able to overcome these barriers and were able to illustrate agency. But when you look at it from the perspective of global South and global North, our perceptions are entirely different. We don't often see it as heroic or overcoming obstacles, that you are a migrant, in a small boat and you reach Turkey or you reach Italy. They have totally different perception. It's a totally different way of defining refugees or people seeking political asylum compared to the 80s. Think of East Germans, if they were able to cross. And
Well, I mean, if you don't want to go into history, I think the Ukraine is
Yeah.
a clear example of that. I mean, it's completely uncontroversial to some extent. I mean,
Yeah.
to welcome Ukrainian refugees. I mean, I haven't, met any Ukrainians while I was there, but I know that there were cars with Ukrainian number plates, so definitely people coming over. And also they had these like refugee welcome centers and train stations. Yeah, it's not controversial because the Ukrainians are white, they're Christians, so they would very much mix into that local population. I mean, if you look at the history of Austria, I mean, the Habsburg Empire was a true multinational state. I mean, out of back then 50 million people they had at the peak, and only 7 million were Austrians, German speakers, right? So the rest were all, like, you had Ukrainians, you had Polish, you had the Czechoslovakian, Hungarian, Romanian, and so forth, right?
Does that also explain why Austria was more open and inclusive when it comes to immigration after World War II? You think they had more of or they are still restricted immigration? I mean, I'm curious how it was in Austria after World War II. Was it sort of like the German model, like guest worker, temporary status, or did Austria give people citizenship more easily if they're coming outside of?
Yeah, so the Austrians worked according to the German model. So there was like the guest worker program, and and they drew from the same countries. Interestingly, I mean, so the Turks, the Yugoslavians, and the Germans attracted the Italians a lot too. I don't know whether there was a special emphasis among Austrians on that. Yeah, Spanish, Portuguese, yeah. Yeah, for the Austrians, yeah, it's draws the same countries. I would say like Yugoslavia and Turkey. Yeah, and so at the beginning, when they signed these guest worker agreements in the 1950s, there was no interest to give citizenship to the guest workers, and then they changed that, I think, in the course of the 1970s, maybe 80s, because there was Unwerbestopp, right? So they stopped accepting new guest workers in 1973, and when that happened, so because at the beginning, before this Unwerbestopp, if you were a guest worker, you could basically hop on the train or the plane, and then you could go back for vacation, back home, and then you can come back to Germany and Austria, no problem. And then when they did this Unwerbestopp, then at that point, it was kind of like if you went back after that, and the employer basically doesn't call you back anymore, right? So in that case, you might surrender your right to return. And so then the guest workers were like, okay, so if that happens, then I'm going to stay here. I'm going to stay in Austria, Germany, and I'm going to sponsor my family back home in Turkey or in Yugoslavia to basically come over to settle in Central Europe. And that happened, which is interesting because after Anwerbestopp, the Austrian government hoped that the guest worker population, the foreign population, would decline, but actually the foreign population increased after that.
Unintended consequence.
Yeah.
Of their policy. Oh.
Yeah, it's a family reunification, and then once you had the families coming over, then the issue was, do we leave them in the legal limbo, right, or do we give them citizenship? And so then the government then decided wisely to give them citizenship rather than leave them in a limbo, right?
Was that SPÖ, Social Democratic government, or I'm curious, or was it right-wing government?
So in
Austria, I don't know.
Right, it was an SPO government up until 83, and then it was a mixed coalition government with the FPO, and then a coalition government with the UFOP. So I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, I think all the political parties make they make a national decision, right? A decision in the national interest. I mean, there's the same thing happened with the European Union when they joined in 1995. There was a referendum in 1994, and at that time, I think the SPÖ was a little bit more on the Eurosceptic side, but then they quickly turned it around. I mean, when they called on the referendum. Because the government negotiated the accession treaty with the EU, right? And then when they put it up for the referendum, of course, both government parties, SPÖ, ÖVP, were promoting the EU membership. And then they voted for it 2/3. I think the Norwegians voted against it. The Austrians, the Swedes, and the Danish voted for it. And then they joined.
But not the Swiss, right? The Swiss always kept out. Switzerland.
Yeah, the Swiss kept out,
Yeah.
I don't think there was ever
I mean,
any serious negotiations with the Swiss for membership. The Swiss, they built themselves a political economic model that seems to be working. I mean, so they're still integrated with the EU because of EFTA. I mean, it's the European Free Trade Association, of which Norway is also a part of that. And and EFTA actually it is somewhat restrictive because basically you're part of the Schengen zone de facto, right? So you could, as an Austrian, I could settle in Switzerland without problems, and vice versa. And the Swiss, they would have to adopt the laws that the European Union passes on things like consumer safety regulations and things like that, right? But the Swiss are not consulted in making these laws, because these laws are determined in the European Commission, right? The commissioners basically appointed by the nation states, right, of the European
yeah.
Union. So I mean, in one sense, I mean, you're part of EFTA, which means you kind of adopt the European laws, but you don't have the seat in the table. It's a little bit like Washington D.C. a little bit, right?
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. So that's good. But would you still say that there's a little bit of utopianism also in the EU idea that is positive? It's an ideal society, something possible as a good society, but overwhelmingly the foundation is still economic interests. I mean, yeah, there's an EU Parliament, there's kind of EU flag, EU identity. All that was formed, after World War II and this evolution of European institutions. But at its core, it's still kind of a utopia too, in a way. It has all these ideal expectations too, and the constraints that nation states, still have these constraints of national interests, and the difficulty you still have with national parliaments and fragmented Europe in a way.
Yeah,
But I wonder, at least they have an EU utopia, like I think the problem in the US may be that they can't even think about a possible unified, collective regional solidarity kind of, unification of Canada with USA, with South America. That's viewed as treason. You're thinking of treasonous ideas. Like how dare you think of this possibility of a, EU kind of, region, if you like. And I wonder if just maybe the culture is that way in the US or even in North America, South America, maybe people are so fragmented historically, different language, and colonialism maybe also played a role, South America, and this problem of overcoming these regional ways of thinking. I mean, think about like even the Quebec area and the French speakers, and how divided they often are with English-speaking Canadians. So here language is still a real divide. In Canada, right? I think in the US you see this blue state, red state, southern culture, and in the New England states, this full divide that we think of north and south, right? Divide. And I'm not sure, maybe South America is this way too. You have regional histories of warfare, and I have to look at South American history, but I'm sure there was antagonism and wars between different countries historically, and they can't overcome it. They maybe have difficulty in a utopian kind of community, a real regional kind of way of looking at it. They're so entrenched. in their national histories. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, I think your point about language is really spot on, right? The fact that if you have too many languages, I think it will make it more difficult to create, this supranational culture that sort of unifies the whole continent. And to that extent, I think that the North American space is much more integrated. I mean, in the sense that for instance, I mean, you don't have to live in California in order to imbibe Hollywood movies and you'd say Hollywood culture, right? It's just going to get transmitted. If you watch the movies and and the cultural products that come out of that sphere. So you really have a unified national market, at least in the cultural sphere. I mean, one of the things, like when I visit relatives in Canada, up in Toronto, I mean, I know that, I mean, and then they look at the TV set and they play a lot of like American TV programs. Like that's one of those things I will notice because, I mean, I don't notice it in America because I sort of expect, okay, American TV shows, but when you go up north and it's like, well, okay, they watch the same stuff that we do over here. And so, yeah, you can create this unified culture. I don't know. I mean, in the European sphere, I would say that, English is now being taught basically in every European country as as a first foreign language, which I believe is important because it that's the basis for the cross-national communication. Some states are much better at it, like I think in the Netherlands, Denmark, and the Scandinavian countries, almost everybody is conversant in English. In Austria, there's Germany, it's okay. I mean, not everybody, but most people. Eastern Europeans, they are now increasingly so. I mean, anglicized, but it takes time because they used to be communist, the Russian. And then so I think that would be the main effort to try to unify. And so there was this like Habsburger Empire, this visionary, Coudenhove Kalergi, and he was one of the early proponents of the pan-Europeanism, like basically he was kind of the ideological father of the European Union. But it's a very difficult objective, I would think, because of the language issue, I think. But with the Europeans, I mean, they feel like they were forced together, and the thing that accomplished this, enforced unity, is war.
World War II.
It's about destruction. Yeah, exactly. It's about. I mean, the core of the European conflict usually was France versus Germany. Those are the two big powers, and basically containing that conflict was the objective of the European Union. And now, because of this Ukraine-Russia conflict, right? There was this idea that, well, is the European Union brain dead? I mean, does the integration stop? Is it going to go into reversal? And I think that the trauma of the Eurozone crisis, the Greek situation in 2010, but then also the difficulty of the refugees in 2015, right, where the member states couldn't agree on who would take the refugees. So, and then the Brexit happened, right, which was, basically the second biggest economy of the EU left. So there was really, for many years, just sort of, I want to call it like centrifugal forces that were taking over, right? Which means, fleeing the center, fleeing the Brussels, the European integration. And now I think there's a possibility, because of the Ukraine war, that that the EU is being again put at the front of the geopolitical struggle, right? So from the Russian perspective, I mean, Putin never took the EU seriously. I mean, he always wanted to deal basically with America first, because they're the biggest force within NATO, right? The military power, economic power, and then maybe France and Germany, because of if you remember the Minsk Accord, which was negotiated by the French Germans initiative. But yeah, the EU he never wanted to take seriously. But the EU would have to become a big force, in the sense that they're making that decision to integrate Ukraine into the EU, and that process is going to take a long time. I mean, probably take at least a generation before membership occurs. But yeah, I mean, that was a big decision. It was a political decision, right? Because normally, I mean, the EU says, okay, we're going to let you in, but you're going to have to do this, this, and this, right? You have to show that you comply with the rule of law, and your consumer safety protections, labor protections, all these things have to be lined up, right?
It's probably going to take 10 years. I think it's a 10-year process. Usually takes a decade.
Yeah, it's definitely a long-term process.
It's not quick like that, no.
Yeah, and also it's a matter of political will, because because the Turks have been having accession negotiations now for almost 20 years, and it's been very much stuck. And because both parties, the Turks and the Europeans, are not interested in advancing the membership. And there was a political decision made in Brussels that that Ukraine should become part of the European sphere of influence, and not Russian.
Yeah.
Right. I think it was the right geostrategic move to make, because so ever since 2004, I mean, the Ukrainians have been part of this tussle between the Russian and the European sphere, the Western sphere, and the Europeans, they always had this sort of like very formal Weberian bureaucratic, approach to its Ukraine, right? It's like, okay, if you do this, this, and this, then we'll talk with you, and then we'll sign more agreements with you. Yes, it's a very strict bureaucratic, while the Russian approach was, it's imperialism, essentially. Sure. They're saying, well, you're part of us, you're part of my empire, and I'm not going to give you any leeway or choice over it. And
use of power, just raw.
Yeah. So see, the problem with that, like, so you have, like, if you have an asymmetric approach like that, then the country in the middle is basically going to be cut up. Now we know that the only right approach is the Europeans would have to ditch the Weberianism. I mean, they would have to, state their own, geopolitical interest themselves, and certainly the Ukrainian candidacy status was probably the clearest declaration for the European interest, right?
Remind me the commissioner's name. Von der Leyen.
Von der Leyen,
she wore, if you recall, when she gave the statement on the candidacy, the Ukrainian flag is like her outfit. So it was kind of a show of solidarity, right? She is the von der Leyen. She's the head of commission, EU Commission president. So that's really sending a symbolic symbol that she wore the Ukrainian flag in the colors. I thought that was interesting, but it shows this, siding with Ukraine, solidarity, right? I wanted to backpedal real quick. I know we kind of drifted into the Ukrainian topic. And I know in the beginning of our podcast, we talked about generations, right? Significance and different generations. And we think of them as cohort, like, a particular time frame that a generation is born into and shares experiences, right? Shares similar economic situations. So that's why the phrase boomer generation come in. What I was thinking about is if we can take this idea of generation, and if it's fair to say that there's also a concept like European generation, like what I mean is, like, if it's possible in 20, 30 or so years that generations, will no longer see themselves just within the framework of a nation state per se, like Germans or French or Italians or Austrians, but this idea of Europeanization to where they see themselves as a European kind of, generation, if you like, and these national references are slowly erased. I mean, they're still part of the identity of individuals or youth in particular. Like, think of the next 20, 30 years, the youth will become more and more European, right? There will be more and more marriages, interethnic, international, if you like, and you'll have this European kind of semi-culture maybe develop where they start to lose their national identity slowly, and they really see themselves as, European generation or European kind of, at least in the mind, and I wonder how difficult it may be for a country like Ukraine, where you have this nationalism just in the symbolism of the flag. Think about how much nationalism is what gives strength often to societies, nation states, to identify themselves within a national framework. And so how, long it will take, for people to slowly kind of just integrate more in a regional setting or regional space rather than just a national one. I hope that makes sense. So what I'm getting at, like, future youth is, my generation, it's not going to happen, but maybe 20, 30, 40, 50 years, in Europe at least, you'll start having a European kind of identity form that separates itself from the national identity, if that's even, it's utopian, or, if it's, we still have regional differences like dialect and language differences, obviously, and different regions that people come from, but will they see themselves really as Europeans?
Right.
Go ahead.
So I think with regard to the point of, like, So let me phrase a more extreme question, which is, are we ever going to get rid of the nation state as a concept? And I have a feeling not in the short term. I mean, in particular, not because, again, it goes back to language, culture, identity. I mean, the fact that, I mean, like you and I mean, we're Germanophiles, just by our, I guess, background. But we cannot share this, Germanophile culture with our friends from the Anglosphere, right? It's just not. I mean, of course, I mean, you could use Google Translate now. I mean, YouTube transcript, whatever. I mean, subtitles. I mean, of course, there's ways how you could still do cross-national linguistic communication, but it's not the same. I mean, people are not gonna, seek out those other sources now. I mean, unless they have a particular interest in that culture, right? In foreign cultures. So, and you could imagine, I mean, this is going to be much more difficult in the European space because there are so many languages, over 20, I guess.
Yeah.
So to that extent, I think the national identities will remain for many, many generations. But this idea of like this pan-Europeanism, I think that idea, that can spread. I mean, if you think about um, the Europeanization of the Fridays for Future movement, right? That started in Sweden with Greta Thunberg, but then you saw these initiatives that cropped up among school children across the whole continent, right? So now you have the national activists all over Europe. And those ideas can certainly spread because of instantaneous communication. I mean, something that happens in a particular region in the world, we're not excluded from knowing about it because of the instant communication. Yeah, but then ultimately, in terms of like, so what are the institutions that would have to be in place in order to create pan-Europeanism? I think that's a very valid sociological approach. So like, about the Erasmus program, right? Where
Of
the
course.
idea is
I benefited from it. I remember, not monetarily, but there was exchange programs from Germany to Sweden and Italy, and it was very fruitful student exchange program. The EU funded. It was small money, but I think they also had faculty exchanges for people that were instructors. They could be mobile. So it was viewed as building bridges between different corners of Europe and allowing this European kind of mobility, between universities, and even a European credit transfer system, which is quite interesting. This problem of national accreditation systems and this, de facto kind of discrimination that you often faced as a scholar if you went to a different country, even within the EU, you would often have difficulty in getting your credentials accredited. But with the ECT system, you could then, get a ECT kind of, that's what happened with my master's degree. It also has a European kind of equivalency that is recognized within all the different nation states within EU, right? And it has the kind of seal and stamp on it. So yeah, that was a unique program, as I recall it. But there were other attempts to kind of unify academic institutions. I think they gave money for like, just money. It's just basically EU funds that were given to students to do it.
That's the right approach, right? So
Yeah.
you create institutions like Erasmus, the student exchange program, or the cultural exchange programs are good too, right? I mean, the Europeans are much more into like opera and theater and like live acting, music, and I mean, if you create these cultural spaces where international exchange happens, where, let's say, I mean, yeah, if you're an actor, I mean, an actor is a very multinational person, right? I mean, you could, you know, be at the film set in Italy, then you go to France, and you go to Germany, and so so those spaces, those spheres would have to be built out. Now, but then there's always a counter argument. It's like, well, okay, so you create this cosmopolitan population, but what about the I don't know, working class person that never leaves the neighborhood, right?
Mm.
And those people exist too, right? It's a reality too, right? And because see, the thing about this whole globalist idea is that you need purchase, you need legitimacy. People have to believe it, people have to act on it. And if you leave out some people, then they're going to be like, well, okay, cosmopolitanism doesn't do anything for me.
It's just for the elite,
Yeah,
academic elite. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's elite. And so that's one of the worries that I have, and I don't think there's an easy way to deal with that, really. I mean, um, yeah, I mean, all we can do is, I mean, we can increase our offerings, but people have to be aware of it,
I
take it up. Yeah.
I think what the EU does to make it more balanced of interests is they have funding for transportation and agriculture and energy. I think one of the offsets because of this Erasmus, you're correct. I mean, it is just for intellectual academic students. It's just targeted for a specific group. So I think what the EU does is they have obviously other programs, agricultural funds, like building roads, bridges, highways, funds, developmental funds, construction projects that has EU kind of support, and regional spending. Regional spending, I think that's how they distribute a lot of their money. So I have to study the EU website, but they usually have all the information out there. But it's a significant amount of money, and often maybe to offset, like if there's costs of immigration to a certain country, I think they also give that country more money. I think that's what happened with Hungary and then Italy. I think the EU gave money to those countries to offset some of the costs associated with housing some of the refugees. But I have to double check it. I have to be sure. But I think that's what happened. So there's kind of offsetting, But
yeah, that's at the institutional level. I think that's important too. I think the solidarity within states and stuff.
You know what else I was thinking of? Actually, sometimes when you watch European movies that are made in Europe, you'll sometimes see not just Ministry of Education or the Ministry of a particular nation state that puts a stamp on the movie that it somewhat gave money to the movie maker or some funding. But I recall that the EU is involved in that too. So the EU will give like individual movie makers funding, but they'll put the little stamp like EU fund that funded this artistic movie. So I see that a lot now. If you watch European films, sometimes even on Netflix, you'll see the little stamp, and I assume that that's how they got funding. They get kind of the funding through either the nation state that has some kind of fund, for movie makers, or the EU has a fund, that they apply for and they get to make the movie, offset some of the cost. So I think the same thing with artists. Sometimes I do that with artists, support their work, right? So yeah, that's interesting approach.
Yeah. I mean, that's certainly right. I mean, but I guess I was sort of very much concerned about the cultural integration aspect, right? I mean by cultural integration, I mean so first of it's about self-identification, right? So do I see myself as a European, right, rather than as a national? And then the second element is, to what extent am I mixing with people from the other nation states? So those are the two main criteria. I mean, of course, there's other things that you briefly addressed with like the common agriculture policy and
Yeah.
like refugee policies. I mean, like basically the policy level. I mean, I think for that you need the integration too, right? Monetary policy, fiscal policy, and all these things. But I think that the the policy level, I think, will follow from the cultural integration, right? Because right now, I mean, so if the European leaders, because the European leaders, many of which are thinking in the pan-European way, they're saying, well, okay, we want to centralize this policy, centralize that policy, and but then the nationals don't really like that, because they're like, well, because Brussels is over there, it's external, it's a bureaucratic force that we don't like, has no legitimacy, we didn't vote for them, and all these things. So yeah, I think we need to have some kind of like deeper going cultural integration, and then the political institutions will respond to that.
I'm with you there. Yeah.
But yeah, it's a very difficult thing too, because
Well,
yeah, I mean, especially like the institutional integration, because right now, for instance, I mean, among the political leaders, right, the people that they send to serve in Brussels, um, you know, they 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 tend to be a little bit lower status, you could kind of say, like Ursula von der Leyen, right? The
yeah,
German
Ursula
example.
von
I
der Leyen.
mean, she was
That's
the
the first name I forgot.
yeah, she's the
The head of the EU Commission.
yeah, she
That's,
was a defense minister in Germany,
yeah.
member of CDU, but she was never going to be the the prime minister, the Bundeskanzler, the chancellor of Germany, right? So she's sort of like she's at the top of the sort of executive ladder in Germany, but not not at the very top, you could say, right? So and I right, so this could be an issue, right? Where I mean, or like I remember a couple of years ago when the Austrian candidates for the EU Parliament elections, and the Social Democrats selected a former TV moderator, to be the lead candidate. I mean, like this guy was never politically active before, but but I guess the calculation was, okay, we're going to print the campaign posters with his face on it, and people can recognize his face because he was the news anchor, right, for many years.
Oh,
Um,
right.
so I mean, that was really how stupid it was. I mean, it wasn't really about policies or anything like that, right?
No, you're right. PR more, yeah, it's really oriented towards PR and just getting your face out there, not content oriented. Totally
Yeah, but then
correct.
I don't know. I mean, then some people say, well, what about national elections? I mean, you just put the campaign poster, you got the face, and then you got the three slogans. Like we want freedom, we want justice, we want equality. It's always the same bullshit, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
Being in politics, I guess.
Uh,
I mean, yeah, it's a very hard. I mean, like, ideally, I mean, can you not put in a campaign poster like the 10 points that that's on your agenda, and just like one sentence, And if people want details, you can leave like a website link underneath.
Well, interestingly, not at the EU level, but I think I told you this before, that in the German election scenario, if you are a minority party and you're a really small party, you do have to illustrate that you have a manifesto, you have some kind of program, you have members, right? You have people that are participating. In order to get to the, being able to be on the list of election, Bundestag election. And I think maybe they have to be stricter, yeah, with some political parties. If they just, from an administrative standpoint, they really do have candidates and everything's legit. And, that's what happened in Germany is they eliminated, I think, a small anarchist party. And they couldn't prove that they really had members, and so I think that would be a fair criteria that, like, even at the EU level, is it a real organized political party? And like you're saying, some kind of program. Shouldn't be just anybody that has a PR, agency that constructs documents and brochures and business cards that you can just run for an EU office, right? Or I think they had to have, if I recall, I remember watching this extensively. This has happened before the German elections. That they had to show, first of all, they had to show in person, and then they had to have 3 members there, and then they had documents that they proved financial aspects to how the political party was like organized, things of that nature. They have meetings and how many people attend meetings, things like that. And there was like a threshold. It was a real minimal threshold. So I think it was fair. But that's interesting. You need to have some basic standard for candidates, not mailbox candidates, right? Just right. So,
Yeah.
so I have to remember exactly, but it was fair. I think it was a fair process. Like, I really watched it. It was interesting because you had animal rights party, you had a Marxist-Leninist party, you had a Trotsky party, you had an anarchist party, and they all were like trying to get a spot on the election list. And I don't know how it's done in Austria. It'd be very interesting. It would be very interesting for me to study how a political party, what process they have to undergo to be able to be listed in the election.
Yeah, we even think for the EU Parliament it might be easier. I mean, to get in as a small party. Martin Sonneborn is a German member of European Parliament, and he's the chairman of Die Partei. And but I don't think there's like really any formal party program. It's really
comedian, right?
Yeah, he's a comedian.
Sarcastic,
he's an activist. And he's like, oh, I'm gonna show these corrupt bastards, how to run the country or whatever, to run the continent.
There was another party called the Pirates Party.
The Pirate Party, yeah.
It was like for this making copying legal, that you can just copy anything, piracy.
This copy left kind of concept.
Yeah, copy left. So there was all sorts of small little parties that ran for election. They hardly have a chance, but that's interesting. Your EU thing, but you would never see, I think, in the US. I think it'd be very overwhelmingly challenging even to think about running as a small party.
Well, there was an effort now by Andrew Yang.
That's right.
He ran twice as a Democrat, but now he's saying, well, I want founding the Forward Party, and I mean, it seems to be gaining some traction. I mean, there's some
Forward, right? It's called
Forward.
The
Forward Party.
Okay. It's going to be like a centrist party or something.
Right. It's designed as centrist because the idea is to get local Republican and Democratic Party people to switch to the Forward Party, essentially. I mean, and of course, the only way how you could sell it to both sides is by placing yourself at the center, so that you were sort of the idea was to gather the reasonable people in both political parties, because I think the problem in American politics, I think, is that the temperature has gone up too much, because it seems to be like we have one, like, I don't know, culture war crisis after another. It seems to be, right. So
Yeah.
for a while, we had the Black Lives
Guns.
Matter activism,
Yeah.
and then you had, okay, well, you had the Tea Party, but it was a little bit older, but then you had the MAGA movement, and there's still like stop the steal narrative that's going around. I mean, so basically, I mean, it seems to be that, and then the problem is that the parties, the representatives, even if they didn't believe in the fringe positions, they would kind of have to take it, because they don't want to be primaried, right, by a more extremist challenger, and so I mean, and the problem, I mean, I don't know, it's like if you have a party duopoly, right, there's a risk that you can have this kind of two-way polarization, which, I mean, if you have like a parliamentary system where you have, let's say, 4 to 6 parties, that's enough factions to basically cover the gamut of the political spectrum, right? I mean, if you have more than that, then it's going to become problematic, like in Italy.
Like Italy, right?
Yeah, basically you have like 3
or
communist
Greece.
parties.
I think Greece. Yeah, maybe too many is a problem, and too few is a problem too. So something in between, like 5, 7 parties or something, and maybe that's okay. But you have 25, 40 parties,
Yeah, then it's difficult to get the government together. I mean,
even Sweden, I think Sweden has somewhere like 9 or 8. I think I have to check, but Sweden has like 9 or 8 parties, including the Feminist Party, and then there's the Social Democrats, and there's their Democrats, which are like right wing, and then there's a leftist party. So it's interesting. Scandinavia usually has a mixture of smaller parties, single issue parties. I was surprised in Europe. There's a lot of move towards like animal rights parties, rights for animals, things of that nature. But I don't know. In the U.S., yeah, it's challenging for smaller parties to run, right? Maybe that would be some good, actually. I mean, imagine if you have a bicycle enthusiast party, wants to ban all cars, and we're going to go. That would be a good single issue party,
Yeah, I have a very big issue with like single issue parties,
Yeah,
in the
yeah,
sense that it's a little bit too opportunistic, because, okay, so then they get voted in, let's say, and then because of some coalition agreement, they are basically supplying the majority votes. But then what happens after that policy gets implemented, right? So let's say, I mean, if you pass animal rights, if you create the bike lanes, what happens then? I mean, then it's like, well, I mean, either you have to redefine the party, okay, you keep the party label, but then you expand to other issues,
yeah,
or you just have to resign your post right away, because you're like, well, okay, I just accomplished my goal already. While, I mean, it seems to be like, if you're like conservative, right, which is like a ideological like commitment, then you can always say, well, there's like hundreds of issues that you have to deal with, right? Or if you're like a liberal, or if you're like a socialist, it's like, if it's like if it's ideological, right, then there's like always issues that you can argue for, right?
right.
But the advantage with the single issue parties is that they increase attention to on a particular topic, right?
You know, it's good that you raised that point, and hopefully I'm not going too long. I know you probably are ready to eat something. You're hungry. Let me know you want to take you want to stop. But something you just talked about that really made me think about the work of Honneth and Nancy Fraser, recognition or redistribution. And I think if you look at the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, this interest for single issues has to do with a struggle for recognition and an emphasis on recognition itself. That's the domain of, I think, politics ever since the 1990s. I think, or maybe even 80s. Maybe it started in the 60s, civil rights, but we can really see it now that the main focus of politics is no longer like a classic redistribution kind of theme, if you like. But if you take the argument by Fraser and Honneth seriously, it's politics is now shaped by the issues of recognition, and which topic kind of motivates people. That it's an identity. It's just an issue of identity or some issue that resonates, and not really about redistribution issues or economic issues. So that's my final argument, that maybe that's also something to overcome, the balance, this issue of recognition and economic issues that are like, if you focus just on globalization as a party, I mean, it's suicide. I mean, you have to, if you think of a modern political party, you have to like find a topic that finds recognition or.
But I mean, the question is, I mean, how do you attain recognition? I mean, as
Yeah.
a group, I mean, does that not involve some form of redistribution? I mean, especially if you're lower income. I mean, I think
Yeah.
I don't think that you can get around the.
Well, I think what the German
redistribution
Greens
issues.
did, what the German Greens were successful in, is they started to move away from the idealistic kind of green fundamentalism, like let's radically go green. And the German Greens started to look pragmatic, even how they dressed. They didn't look like hippies anymore. Like the first German generation of German Greens, they literally looked like hippies. They had long hair, they dressed like hippies, anti-war, anti-capitalist, And then in the 80s, in the 90s, like think of Joschka Fischer, they started to look like a moderate class. You can't really tell, if they're focusing on what issue, and they would like branch out into different issues. And they started addressing like multiculturalism, and they would go after what were social democratic issues, the Greens. It's no longer just anti-nuclear, disarmament, pacifist kind of. But they started to go into issues that were identity politics issues, right? LGBTQ became a focus. So the German Greens, I think they kind of more evolved as a party. But the American Greens, I can sort of, like, there's American Green Party. They're still kind of in the development phase, and I see that they kind of have a problem in being able to maneuver, with this constant political change, constant change of issues. My observation.
Well, I mean, in America, it's much harder to accommodate the green topics because of the two-party system, right? So, if you're a Green Party candidate, I mean, like Jill Stein, and you get maybe 3% of the vote, overwhelmingly from a few college towns, essentially professors and so forth.
California, most of them.
Yeah, right. And so that's going to be an issue, because the political system is not amenable to tolerate the third parties. So usually, what happens, and we saw that in the turn of towards the 20th century, early 20th century, right, in the progressive movement, the progressive era, when like there was this, like the silver populist movement, right? Which the idea was, okay, we're gonna go away from the gold standard. We're gonna be printing silver because there's more silver mines in the country. and then thereby, we're gonna have a soft currency, and then we can redistribute more resources to the poor and things like that. And the Progressive Party, of course, didn't go anywhere. I mean, they didn't get elected to office, but it was absorbed into the party programs of the Democrats and then also the Republicans to some extent. So, or for instance, I mean, the New Deal, right, under Franklin Roosevelt. When Roosevelt took over the party, I mean, it was, centrist, and then he took over, and he was like, well, okay, it's the middle of a Great Depression. There's a lot of activism around socialist parties, and we want to steer the votes that would go to socialists to the Democratic Party. And the best way to do that is to support progressive income taxes, with very high marginal tax rate for the rich.
Well, shifted a little to the left, right?
Yeah, and so that was the basis of
Keynesian.
the New Deal coalition
Yeah,
that
definitely.
lasted until the Nixon Southern Strategy, maybe 1968, maybe something like that.
So that we say is redistribution, that the political focus really was on redistribution. And rather than, if you think of the Democratic Party in the 80s and 90s, it's more on identity and recognition, the focus. I mean, there's still the Clinton era. Yeah, I mean, there was this idea of government intervention and spending, but curious if it's similar to the New Deal. If the Democrats,
the logic of Clintonism was to basically shift to the so-called center, but it's really a shift to the right wing in terms of the fiscal policy, and then it was about opening up the to the culture left. So it's about the LGBT, it's about women's rights and minority rights and things like that. So you shift the culture left, but then you economic center right.
no.
And then you have a problem because then you create this vacuum, right? So okay, what if you're culture right or culture centrist and economic left?
Yeah.
So you're socially conservative, but you want you want redistribution, which is a lot of the working class voters are like that. So Trump was. Well, I mean, they could have been absorbed by Bernie. I mean, if Bernie Sanders had won the Democratic primaries, I think they would have stuck in the Democratic camp. But he didn't. He lost twice. And so in each of these elections, the last two cycles, I mean, it created the opening for for Trump ultimately to fill that vacuum, right? And so I mean, predicting the next election is going to be tough, to be quite frank. I would think that I agree with Bernie's position that like there has to be a broad coalition, right? Like a real rainbow coalition, right? Like Jesse Jackson in the 80s. And the idea really is like, basically you kind of remain silent on the culture issues because culture issues are a little bit too polarizing, right? But then on the economic policy, you swing a little bit to the left. So that was.
Yeah, I'll go ahead. I was asking, do you think that the problem is in the balancing of, the fallacy might be too much economic reductionism, or the fallacy is, on the other hand, too much identity reductionism, where you're like, if we, political parties just reduce their objective, like the Democrats, if they just, we're just focusing identity and then ignore the economic, that cost them election. So the difficulty is in balancing, both issues of identity and economic, redistribution. So yeah, I would see that as problematic. Difficult to maintain your balance. Otherwise, Republicans, it's easy. It's just identity. It's all about immigration. It's just guns. And just totally ignore economic issues. On the other hand, maybe for Democrats, they often, are put back into this economic or identity reductionism complex for parties to get out of.
Yeah,
But it hurts them. I hope I'm not confusing my own statement.
there's something very interesting. I mean, I saw this poll somewhere, I think on Twitter. It was about the Senate seat projections after the midterms, and apparently the Democrats are doing quite well now. I mean, they're going to get over 50, 55, 56 seats, and I guess the assumption that I guess that the polling agency makes is that abortion is back on the agenda, and it would, because the idea is that, I mean, not that the vast majority of voters are going to be swing voters on the abortion issue, but there's going to be some, and and that's going to tilt the balance in the midterms. And this is a big question, right? Because I think the Republicans know this, which is the reason why they focus on inflation and the economy. Which, I mean, with inflation, I mean, this is a global problem. I mean, it's like everybody will. I mean, a lot of incumbent governments are in democratic countries are failing right now. I mean, to get reelected because of the inflation issue. But yeah, I mean, but for the Democratic Party, they're like, okay, they have to, they will ride on the mantle of the the abortion and the gun issue. That's really put on the agenda because of the conservative-leaning Supreme Court, right? Yeah, so there's a possibility that maybe the Democrats might take advantage of that.
Yeah, we'll see.
Social issue.
Hard for us to predict. We always see it when it happens like this.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Sociology is slow journalism, right? We're going to be slow in our analysis, right?
Yeah, I think things are very dynamic. I mean, to be honest with you, I mean, so before, when was the Dobbs ruling? It was probably like last month or so, right?
Yeah.
End of June or something. But before that, I mean, abortion was not on my agenda at all.
Oh, you're talking about the Supreme Court decision? Okay,
yeah,
Dobbs. I'm sorry. Took me a minute to.
Dobbs versus Jackson. Yeah, I think. Before that, I mean, I wasn't aware of it that much. I mean, I knew already that because of the 6-week ban in Texas, that that the issue sort of came back from that side, but I hadn't anticipated that that nationally that abortion would be stopped. The national ruling would be stopped. I mean, now it's up to the states. Yeah, I mean, you can read cases of women that are they were raped, or they have some kind of medical issue that's going to make it hard for them to carry the baby to term. I mean, there's a lot of like individual circumstances that like if a state turns from like, we allow it this month and the next month we prohibit it, I mean, it can be enormously upsetting, right? To make these kinds of changes.
It's a major controversial issue here in the South, and particularly, it's Texas and Oklahoma and much of the deep South, you pro-life has pretty much a leverage, and so pro-choice movement has a real challenge and difficulty. This is still a Bible Belt. I mean, the whole idea of the Bible Belt, it's so it's yeah, it's challenging that on this specific issue, really on this issue, and yeah, particularly if you're a Democrat. And on this issue, it can make or break you if you're pro-life or pro-choice. So yeah, it's a very interesting area. Now this goes back to, by the way, the question of Fraser, right, and Honneth, of what is it that motivates politics in the U.S. and it seems to be culture wars, right? Culture wars. So it's not economic redistribution, right? So even wars about curriculum in the classroom, CRT, to abortion as a issue, right? To I think the latest one was therapy for trans children and receiving medical treatment. I think that was a topic. Trans athletes, that's another culture war topic. So if I follow the argument by, again, Nancy Fraser and Honneth, this divide is a struggle between recognition identity, or let's just call it culture war topics, and economic redistribution, right? It could be both sometimes, but it seems in the US, it's moving always towards social cultural issues. Right? And then, yeah, Supreme Court decisions, that's clearly on the legalistic cultural side. Yeah, which it's interesting. I don't know, in Europe, it's not that, it doesn't seem to be a topic. I think in Europe, they've already moved away from that topic of abortion, unless you're in Poland. But I think all the other European countries have pretty much legalized it and continue to show support.
I was reading an article about access issues.
Yeah.
It's both in Austria and in Germany. I think if you live in a big city, like if you live in Vienna and Berlin, it might be okay. But then, it's, in the countryside, there's an issue because I know in the western province in Tyrol and in Vorarlberg, they only have one abortion doctor for the entire province, and the journalists went and interviewed the doctor in Vorarlberg, and he's he's a 73-year-old man, and he says that he's booked out months in advance, and he only takes vacation like 1 week a year, which is very unusual in European countries. It's more like 4 or 5 weeks is very common. And yeah, I mean, he's 73 years old. I mean, he's going to retire soon, and then it's like, well, okay, who's gonna take up the mantle? It's difficult because in rural areas, like, I mean, you don't have like this kind of like Bible Belt, U.S. South kind of activism, fervor, but it's more like a very quiet, like, we believe in pro-life too. That's sort of the moral atmosphere, you could say, right?
In rural parts of Austria, right?
In rural parts of Austria, yes.
So more Catholic, I think, probably more Catholicism is still very strong in the rural areas.
That's
Austria.
right. Yeah. So
same thing in Bavaria.
Yeah, right. So
yeah.
But I guess like if you go to München or Nuremberg, I'm sure you can access, abortion services, right?
Reversed a law that was still on the books. I think it was a month ago, that prohibited the advertisement of abortions. They criminalized it, but they removed it. But there was a law that you couldn't advertise abortion services. Yeah, so that happened about a month ago. I think that went to the Bundestag. But yeah, so.
Right.
But
It's again a very conservative approach, right? Because
Right.
I mean, if you're like an abortion service doctor, I mean, but what can you put into your advertisement? I mean, you can say, well, if you have issues with your pregnancy, you can come talk to me or something like that, right? But you cannot say, what kind of abortion service you are providing, right? Something like
well, okay.
totally
Good,
ridiculous.
good
Okay, anyway,
topics
so
to discuss today.
yeah,
Want to keep
so
going, or we had enough?
yeah, okay, so I think we'll have enough topics
Yeah.
even for our next chat. I mean,
Yeah,
so
yeah, we'll
thank you
do it
very
again.
much, Mike, for your time and
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
dedication to this. Okay, I thank all my listeners as well.